Since the establishment of the United States, children have been taught about the prosperity of white people over the land and Indians, or, more correctly put, people who are native or indigenous to the U.S. Non-indigenous children are taught about indigenous peoples as if they do not exist anymore, as if the land stolen from them rightfully belonged to the colonists who settled in the 1600s. We are not, however, educated in how the supposed success came to be, or who pays the price for prosperity. My research question is, what are the implications of federal legislation concerning indigenous peoples on sovereignty, culture, and self-identity within contemporary society? Existing literature is vast in terms of its recognition of indigenous rights issues, but very few people address the intersection between policy and anthropology. I consolidate the importance of land rights and their influence on indigenous cultures, shifts in public opinions in relation to the implementation of federal legislation, and the ways the U.S. government has wielded power to undermine the sovereignty of indigenous nations and perpetuate structural inequality. Even though most of the legislation was implemented over 100 years ago, they still have a significant presence in contemporary society regarding social, political, and economic issues. This semester, I am working on grounding issues of indigenous rights in Gratiot County, specifically focusing on Alma College to learn who occupied the land we are standing on before it was colonized and how the ownership of the land has changed over time. Next, I want to explain some guiding terms and concepts that are key to understanding my research. Throughout this presentation, I use the umbrella term Indigenous peoples because it is the most effective way to describe the groups of peoples that are largely affected by these pieces of legislation. Not all Indigenous peoples or cultures are the same, which means that not everything that is said or implied applies to every nation or every individual who identifies as Indigenous. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples asserts the right of Indigenous peoples to a self-identification and self-determination. Within the international community, tribal sovereignty is used to describe a state's independence in relation to other states and the extent to which it has the ability to live and operate free from interference of outside forces. This is important to recognize because acknowledging sovereignty and the ways that power has been wielded against indigenous nations is the first step in a long process of strengthening tribal, cultural, and economic autonomy among indigenous peoples. A prominent barrier in working towards sovereignty is the result of widespread and deep-rooted existence of settler colonialism, which is a form of colonialism wherein settlers create a new home for themselves apart from their homeland, while legalizing settler colonial institutions and criminalizing indigenous ecological practices and relations to the land. The logic of elimination predicated by settler colonialism legitimized the cycle of incentives used by federal and state governments to acquire ownership of tribal land and the cultural identity of indigenous peoples. An ideology is a fairly coherent and comprehensive set of ideas that explains and evaluates social conditions, helps people understand their place in society, and provides a program for social and political action. During the process of nation building in the United States, European explorers intentionally constructed indigenous peoples as savage and uncivilized to create a dichotomy between indigenous peoples and white people. To prove the superiority of white people, scientists, doctors, and anthropologists alike appealed to the supposed biological difference between racial groups, promoting a doctrine of racial determinism. Racism and racial determinism then became the backbone of ideology upon which white settlers used to justify their actions. The figure on the slide, for example, depicts anthropologist Urdin Houghton's study of the statistical biological differences between races, which do not exist. The ruse of colonial dominance situated white people as inherently superior and was later used to justify the control of indigenous peoples, cultures, and land as necessary. Epistemology is the theory of knowledge, especially with regard to its methods, validity, and scope. For most indigenous peoples, land is inherently tied to culture in a way that is entirely different from Westerners. Native communities maintain complex and dynamic relationships to their land bases because of the spiritual and physical connection to the land itself. While indigenous peoples subsisted on the land to survive, many tribes also draw wisdom from the land through placemaking, orienting themselves in time and place to reproduce human history. Indigenous peoples do not necessarily need to read or write history books because their history is inscribed within the land itself. Their land is part of their identity, their past, and is absolutely necessary for a better future. In terms of federal legislation, as the conception of the public's conception of indigeneity has changed or shifted over time, so has federal legislation. Each of these major pieces of legislation represents a shift in public opinion. The painting on the slide, completed in 1804, reflects the public opinion of Indigenous peoples during that time period as savage and uncivilized, which is explicitly stated in the Declaration of Independence and influenced these 3 Supreme Court cases. And they intentionally worked to diminish Indigenous peoples' rights to their own land. While it's extremely clear that each of these pieces of legislation were and are extremely harmful, they were not necessarily meant to be. The General Allotment Act, for example, was meant to help Indigenous peoples by civilizing them through forceful assimilation. But because of that, it is considered one of the most destructive pieces of legislation to Indigenous people. During the beginning of the 18th century, colonists viewed Indigenous peoples as a vanishing race who were bound to demographic and cultural extinction. If you look at the photo, you'll notice a caption under T.M. Buffington that says, "Probably their last chief." The entire article talks about how Indigenous peoples are vanishing, which is reflective of popular American culture. And believe it or not, these pieces of legislation are still in effect. Currently, approximately 56 million acres of individual and tribal Indigenous land is held in trust by the federal government. The theft of land and mixed ownership within reservations, because of the Dead Indian Act, poses extensive challenges for maintaining sovereignty, self-determination, and self-identity among Indigenous nations. To answer my research question, what are the implications of federal legislation concerning Indigenous peoples on sovereignty, culture, and self-identity within contemporary society, I prominently draw from articles, from peer-reviewed articles and novels. While gathering information, I intentionally sought out ethnographies written by Indigenous peoples or others who worked closely and ethically with them, like Keith Basso in Wisdom Sits in Places, shown here. To address the impact of federal legislation on sovereignty, culture, self-identity, specifically the social and economic impacts, I collected statistics from the US government and texts written by Indigenous peoples. And to piece together the history of land that Alma College occupies, I went to the CMU Clark Historical Library, the Alma College Library, and MELCAP. Based on my research, I discovered various social, economic, and political issues within contemporary Indigenous nations as a result of federal and state legislation. These issues are not the fault of Indigenous peoples, but symptoms of a structure of oppression. Despite supposed progress made in terms of Indigenous land rights, Indigenous peoples continue to live in genocide because of the impact federal legislation has had on their sovereignty by disrupting their ability to develop self-identity. The relocation of Indigenous peoples and reallocation of Indigenous land severely limits political autonomy and increases marginalization, resulting in high rates of psychological deprivation. Inequalities perpetuated by federal legislation increase cultural stress. Carmen Watson Charles, for example, of the Lower Elwha Klallam, describes having felt naked before reconnecting with her nation's land. In addition to psychological effects, inequalities are embodied physically and lead to high incidences of social issues, largely as a result of historical trauma and people's response to attempted genocide. This includes features such as depression, somatic symptoms, substance abuse, suicide ideation, and the internalization of ancestral suffering. Long-term cultural stress and trauma have negative impacts on the broad spectrum of individual, familial, and collective health, which build over time and cause social issues to arise at higher rates within contemporary Indigenous nations compared to the rest of the United States. This is especially true for rates of infant mortality, life expectancy, diseases, and economic development. Lack of economic development on reservations also contributes to cultural stress heavily. It is inherently related to politics because it's intertwined with sovereignty, access to resources, cultural issues, and ideology. A lack of economic opportunity is compounded by the inability to cultivate crops forcing a reliance on state paternalism. Most jobs Indigenous peoples are able to obtain are within the tribal government, Bureau of Indian Affairs, state social service, or within the school systems, which are all part of state and federal governments. This means that Indigenous nations heavily rely on federal and state governments to survive, and that the structure established in 1887 necessitates dependence within contemporary society. And unfortunately, Michigan and Gratiot County are no exceptions to the lasting impacts of actions taken by settlers. A significant portion of Indigenous land was stolen in Michigan as a result of actions taken by Lewis Cass. As the governor of the Territory of Michigan beginning in 1813, Cass initiated treaty negotiations with Indigenous peoples across what is now considered to be the state of Michigan. He was then and now considered to be extremely territorial and implemented almost any means necessary to obtain the land Indigenous peoples occupied. The first treaty Cass initiated was with Indigenous peoples of what is now occupying Alma, which was the Treaty of 1815, Treaty of Spring Wells. In this treaty, the Three Fires tribes agreed to end their hostilities against the U.S. and abandon their alliance with Britain. In return, Cass agreed to restore the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi tribes all the possessions, rights, and privileges they were entitled to before the War of 1812. Promises of which Cass did not fulfill. One of the most significant and devastating treaties in Michigan was the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. Although Anishinaabe ancestors strongly resisted selling their land, Cass employed underhanded tactics to convince them to sell. He showed up to the negotiations with 662 bottles of whiskey, or gallons of whiskey, pardon. He gave the Anishinaabe enough whiskey to keep the people who opposed the sale away, while helping him dominate the negotiations with those who were willing to sell. The first article of this treaty gave away 16 million acres of land, and the second article gave away many more to traders and their Anishinaabe children. And you can see the Treaty of 1819 in this map, the large section of yellow over Alma and Gratiot as a whole. Although I am unaware of what happened after these treaties, I still have a significant amount of research to complete on the history of land occupation in Alma, which will be included in the final draft of my thesis. The main goal of my thesis is to collect all the information necessary for Alma College to produce a land acknowledgement statement in the future. Moving forward, Indigenous peoples need to work toward dismantling colonial ideology by first addressing the issue at its roots at federal, regional, and local levels. While Indigenous epistemologies and lifeways need to be respected and reestablished within their own nations, the general population, specifically institutions and those in power, need to recognize Indigenous land and expertise. And addressing issues perpetuated by these pieces of legislation, cases, and treaties is absolutely necessary to establish lasting bottom-up change that works to increase equity and equality. The general population, through the power of the people, urge for the implementation of these policies. We have the power to undo them. I would like to thank these people for their help in my project, Mr. Frank Bowles, Dr. Collins, and especially Dr. Landau. And if you would like to read my paper once I have finished all of my research, my email is included here. Thank you.